was the copy of the report leaked to the Sunday Times produced?
It was produced over a variety of months. So the final copy was presented to a Cabinet Committee in the first week of August, on the 2nd of August.
2nd of August.
But it is important to bear in mind that while there were some elements of it which were presented for the first time to the relevant Cabinet Subcommittee on the 2nd of August, much of the content, in particular those that relate to assumptions about trade flows at the border, were based on work that had been generated months earlier.
But by definition, if the document was dated the 2nd of August, and it appears that's the copy that the Sunday Times got, it could not have been leaked by former ministers who left office in the week beginning of the 22nd of July. So can you explain why Number 10 briefed that it was?
I have no knowledge of that Number 10 briefing.
You have no knowledge?
Obviously, there's been speculation in the newspapers, but I have no knowledge of that specific briefing.
Well, we all read it in the newspapers, and
indeed,
Philip Hammond took grave exception to it, which is why he wrote to the Prime Minister on the 24th of August.
I quite understand why my constituency neighbour and friend Philip would have written as he did. It seems to me that there is no evidence to suggest that whoever leaked it, that it could have been Philip.
Right. Is it still a possibility it could have been other people who had been serving in the government prior to the current Prime Minister's election?
It would be wrong for me to speculate, but I can't see how that could have happened.
Right, exactly. Well, that is very helpful. Now, why did you say on the 18th of August it was an old report when it was dated, as you've just confirmed to us, the 2nd of August?
Because most of the material within it long predated the presentation of the report on the 2nd of August. And in particular, I think it was important to recognise that that report having been presented to the committee, we said, as a committee, it's vitally important that we test the assumptions within it. Rather than being presented with a set of assumptions that were framed under the preceding government, under Theresa May's government, we now need to test all of those assumptions. So, in effect, it was a document that reflected decisions that had been taken in that government, and of course I'd served in that government, but a new set of assumptions, a new set of tests had to be applied to that document. So, in a way, it was the handover document from the old government to the new, outlining the work that had been done under the old government, much of it very good, but which we wanted to test. To present it in two ways, both as the considered definitive position of the new government and also, as some had sought to do, as a base case scenario, would have been wrong.
But there are two separate things. One is assumptions about what is going to happen, which is based in large part on what others will do that the government doesn't control, for example, French customs officials. We'll come to that point in a moment. But are you saying that the Cabinet was presented with a document on the 2nd of August that contained a lot of out-of-date assumptions?
Well, I think, again, to be precise, the Cabinet was presented with a document with a series of assumptions, recommendations and analyses that had been compiled under the previous government. Some of that work was presented for the first time, but the work had been ongoing under the previous government, and there was then an opportunity for this government to test that. One of the things that I'm very keen to do is to make sure that the basis on which certain judgments are made is widely understood, widely shared, and communicated fairly, and communicated in a way which gives people all the context that they need. We may go into a more developed discussion about some of the figures and some of the assumptions in that document and how they might change and how they've been generated. But I think it's important to say that the presentation at that moment gave people to understand that this was a live assessment that the government at that point endorsed in every particular, and also I think it was important to stress that the coverage at the time, and I don't make a complaint about it because having been a working reporter I know that you operate at pace and you don't always have access to perfect information, but the reporting at the time also suggested that this was somehow a base case scenario, and there were comments by distinguished external figures that gave succour to that analysis.
Well, I want to come on precisely to that point.
Yes. Because
in the same interview on the 18th of August, you described what was in Operation Yellowhammer as absolutely the worst case.
Yes.
Those are your words. Is that the wording used in the report?
It is a reasonable worst case scenario.
So in the report it says a reasonable worst case scenario?
Absolutely.
That's what it says. So does the report use at all the phrase base case or base scenario?
No.
No. Okay. That's very clear.
And I think it was important to state that because in the reporting, and again I make no criticism of the reporter, it was stated in the Sunday Times that there was somehow a worst-case scenario, an even bleaker picture, which was designated Black Swan. I think that, without wanting to go into why that idea emerged, I felt it was important to state that there was no worst-case scenario that existed in any government document beyond that which Yellowhammer contemplates.
Fine. Okay, that's very clear. Does the document contain a reasonable best case or a reasonable in-the-middle case?
No. And I think it's important to...
right, okay. It doesn't.
Important to explain the purpose of the Yellowhammer document. It is not the case that Yellowhammer is a set of predictions about what the government considers, or indeed independent analysts consider to be the most likely outcome. It exists much in the same way as other documents which constitute part of the National Risk Register exist, in order to ensure, as I'm sure those who've served in government will appreciate, that in the event of a set of factors coming into play which create problems for the government, that we can work out what the mitigations are.
Okay.
The use of the word reasonable is in order to ensure that there is a rational basis for that judgment, that it's not, as it were, science fiction, but it is a worst-case scenario against which we can plan so that, were the worst to materialise, we could in advance seek to mitigate its impact.
Okay, that's very clear. Now, last Sunday you said there will be no shortages of fresh food.
Yeah.
As you'll be aware, the British Retail Consortium put out a statement saying, and I quote, "It is categorically untrue that the supply of fresh food will be unaffected under a No Deal Brexit." Could you tell the committee why the British Retail Consortium, which actually imports food and distributes it to supermarkets, is wrong?
Well, I can't know exactly why the BRC chose the words that they did, but I do know two things which are, I think, material and relevant. The first is that you were kind enough to invite Andrew Opie of the BRC to give evidence yesterday, and I think that he gave welcome clarity. I think it is the case that when people talk about shortages, certainly in headline terms, they imagine empty shelves, and they imagine that the standard range of choice, broad choice, with which we've all become familiar, will somehow be reduced. They imagine a situation similar to the one that might occur in a dreadful extreme weather event or after a fuel crisis or whatever. The point that Andrew made, and indeed I worked with him at DEFRA and I have the highest regard for him and for others, is that they are talking about likely disruption, and indeed there is the potential for disruption, and we may go on to exactly how likely that is. And he said that we can talk about the categories of fresh food which may be likely to be affected by that. It will affect fresh food in various ways: availability, shelf life, and potentially cost pressure. The point that I made, or sought to go on to make in that interview, is that in the event of a reasonable worst-case scenario, what we are likely to see is the price of some food commodities rise and the price of some other food commodities fall. You'll be familiar, as the committee will, with the fact that economists use a term like scarcity to describe the fact that a constriction in supply at a given time might lead to price rises increasing. But in common parlance, scarcity sounds as though we're living in a world where we can't get what we need. So I think it's appropriate to draw a balanced distinction. The second point I'd make about the British Retail Consortium is that they quite rightly want to ensure that the government does everything possible, not just to mitigate the consequences of any no-deal scenario, but to secure a deal, because that would be in the best interests of their members and indeed all of us.
Okay, now, but you do accept that November is the time of the year where we are heavily dependent on importing certain types of fresh food, and therefore it's going to be a particular challenge because of the timing of a no-deal Brexit if it happens on the 1st of November. You accept that?
I absolutely accept that there are specific challenges at different times of the year. There is no good time of year to leave the European Union without a deal.
I agree.
However, we have to be ready for those consequences. There were specific challenges had we left on March the 29th or in April, which reflected the import and export flow into this country. It's also the case, again, just to put it in context, that because the 1st of November occurs shortly before the retail event that's become widely known as Black Friday, and also shortly before Christmas as well, that there's an additional pressure on warehousing space as well. So in the interest of being fair with this committee, I would say yes, there are flows of certain fresh foods which are greater at that time, just as there's greater pressure on warehousing space. But there are also lesser pressures at that time of year as well.
That's very helpful. Can I just turn to one issue about exports? Because obviously we export a lot of food.
Yes.
Your former responsibility as the DEFRA Secretary. As you know, after the 1st of November, in the event of a no-deal exit, pallets, transporting goods, including food, from the UK to the EU will have to be heat treated or fumigated to comply with ISPM 15.
Yes.
Now, the Freight Transport Association told us yesterday there is a shortage of such pallets. Is that correct?
There has been in the past. Action is being taken to deal with it. Both DEFRA and the Forestry Commission have talked to the wood packaging materials sector, dating back to the time when I was DEFRA Secretary. The sector is engaged, it's aware of the potential risks of no deal, and they're taking steps to mitigate those risks by improving the processes, both to increase treatment capacity and to increase their stock of those pallets which are ISPM 15 compliant. And the wood packaging materials sector is communicating its position to all of its members and also to EU counterparts. Right, I think it's also important to stress that, as the committee will be aware, broadly of the hauliers who operate between the UK and the EU, just over 3/4 come from the EU, carry goods into the UK, then collect goods in the UK and take them back. Almost by definition, those themselves will have the appropriate pallets as they come into the UK because they'll be EU compliant at that point.
That's very helpful, but it doesn't quite answer the question. Are there enough pallets that comply with ISPM 15?
Well, the specific question there, and it goes to a broader point, is I can be asked, any of us can be asked, will there be enough of X or Y in any available scenario? It all depends by what one means as enough. One of the things about any market scenario is that government can obviously seek to ensure that the market operates as effectively as possible, and we can seek to ensure that traffic and freight flow as quickly as possible. Having been alerted months ago to this situation, we have taken every step in order to deal with it.
Doesn't sound to me from those two answers, Mr. Gove, that you know the answer to the question. Well, are there enough? Now, you would accept, because you've put out guidance, the government has itself, that there could be quite serious consequences for consignments of goods that turn up in the EU, yes, not on a permitted pallet, which could ultimately lead to the destruction of the consignment, because that's the advice that you have given. So, can I ask you one more time, and if you don't know the answer, it's fine, just say I don't know. Are there enough of the required pallets, yes or no? Well,
the key, the thing I would challenge is that it's perfectly possible to ask a question that appears reasonable, but that contains within it an assumption that that it is impossible to objectively verify.
Well, that was a wonderful Sir Humphrey answer.
Thank you.
But I think, as they say, we'll take that as a no. You can't answer that question now.
Well, you can take it in any way you think.
Well, I will. Now, what's your expectation about the most likely delay for lorries travelling from Dover to Calais? The most likely.
In what sense? The most likely cause of delay?
No, the most likely delay in terms of time.
Oh, time. Again, this is something that we're constantly revising. If it is the case that by October the 31st, in the event of a no-deal scenario, every business is aware of what it needs in order to export, then there should be no delay.
Right. Now, I asked you on Tuesday, and I didn't get an answer then, whether the government, it's true that the government has seen an analysis done from the Department of Transport in the last fortnight. It was reported by, I think, Sky News, that in the worst case, average delay for lorries and freight at Dover would be 1.5 days, and in the best case, a wait of 2 to 3 hours. Now, can you just very simply confirm that the government has received that analysis?
Not quite. The first part
hadn't quite received it, or the reporting of it is not quite an accurate description of what was in it.
The latter.
Right. So what did that report say about the average likely delay in between the best and the worst?
It didn't.
It didn't.
I'll tell you what.
Okay.
What it did say, again in the spirit of openness, it is the case that the 1.5 to 2.5 delay scenario is drawn from the reasonable worst case scenario that we did have in the original Yellowhammer document.
Fine.
Now, we are seeking to test that, and we will publish, of course, I hope in full, the workings behind that. On the specific point, the best case scenario, if everyone understands what it is that they need to do, is that there will be no delay. But it is the case that if a lorry were to arrive and were not to have the necessary documentation before it left the UK, then it is estimated that it could take up to 2 hours in order to ensure that that lorry then had the documentation in order to complete its journey. But it may well be the case that that lorry or that consignment is met or recognises that it doesn't have that documentation well before it gets to the short straits.
Okay. Now, we were told, just for information yesterday, by our witness who formerly was working in HMRC, that the French authorities had told HMRC that trucks without the correct paperwork will be held for between 2 and 8 hours. Is that your understanding?
They will be held. I can't make a specific judgment about how long, but I can tell you a little bit more about that process for the benefit of the committee.
Okay, right. And finally from me, we were told yesterday that Calais has space for 300 lorries to be put in a red lane for inspection because they haven't got the right paperwork. Can you just tell us what happens when all of those spaces are full?
Well, it's an amber lane, not a red lane. Okay. A distinction perhaps without a difference. But
well,
but I
we
think
were told yesterday it was a red lane, but I'm glad for the correction on colour.
It's again important. The key thing is that having visited Calais last Friday, it is the case that if lorries have the appropriate documentation, they can travel through clearly. If they do not, yes, they will be kept at that point, and then they will either be returned to the UK in order to ensure that they're compliant, or if it is the case that while there, they can use customs agents or freight forwarders in order to ensure that papers that appear not to be compliant can be rendered compliant, they can then move on.
Right, which doesn't quite answer the question. What happens, because it's a practical problem of flow, what happens when all 300 spaces are full?
Then they're full.
They're full, and fine. And then what does that mean for lorries that are on ferries? They can't get off, can they?
It all depends on whether or not they have the documentation required.
And will that checking be done in Dover to prevent lorries that can't get into the 300 spaces because they're full, or will be returned, don't actually make the journey?
They'll be done before that. This is the important point. Oh, and another important point. It is our intention to ensure that the minimum number of lorries arrive at Dover without appropriate documentation. And one of the things that we are seeking to do through our business information campaign is to explain to hauliers and businesses, what do you need to do in order to be compliant? The French authorities and the European Commission are helping to ensure that the 3/4 of hauliers who come from the EU also know what it is so that they can be compliant. It will also be the case that we will be making sure across the United Kingdom that hauliers are told what it is that they need to be compliant and not to get on the ferry if they're not. It will also be the case that we have legislative powers as a result of a statutory instrument that we're passing to ensure that if a lorry is not compliant and it is, I was about to use the word intercepted, that's too strong, it's stopped by the relevant authorities, that it can be sent back or fined. So we're doing everything possible in order to ensure that you do not have lorries arriving at the short straits and then making the journey which are not compliant for the reasons that you've outlined.
The truth of all of this is no one, including your good self, can actually know what's going to happen after the 1st of November. Would that be a fair assessment?
Well, I think the future is known only to the Almighty.
Well, he's not a witness before the committee today. John
Not
Whitting,
today.
Thank you. Can I come back to the Yellowhammer documents?
Yes.
In December of last year, I, together with our chairman and one or two other members of the committee who are members of the Privy Council, went for the briefing of Privy Councillors on the consequences of a no deal. The briefing looked remarkably similar to the Yellowhammer document that the Sunday Times published. Now, you have explained a lot of Yellowhammer was based on work carried out some considerable time earlier. So can you say to what extent there has been a change in the analysis contained in the document presented to Cabinet in August from the analysis presented to us in December of last year?
It's a very good point. In essence, there have been 3 different iterations so far of looking at the assumptions of what is likely to happen at the border. And they've been revised, and they're based on 2 essential processes. One process is a survey of business readiness. And that, again, can't we can't know exactly how ready every business is. But surveys are carried out, and businesses can say as a result, yes, we're broadly ready, we know what is required. So that's one set of statistics. Then another set of statistics is the DFT's work, an algorithm and so on what is likely to happen on the roads leading towards Dover. They're put together, and they assume what a worst-case scenario is. Now, by definition, if it is the case that the government undertakes steps which ensure that business can become more ready, then one part of that equation, one variable in that equation becomes better overall. And we're now, in another iteration, taking account of the fact that more work has been done, not just since November, but of course since August, to help prepare business. We'll publish what those figures are in due course, but you're absolutely right that the assumptions that were made in November and the assumptions with which we were presented in August were similar. There was an exercise specifically in June in revising them. They weren't revised very materially then. They are being looked at now. So in that sense, you're absolutely right. There would have been a familiarity in what you saw in the newspapers and what you were presented with several months ago.
Thank you. But as you say, in the intervening period, work should have been done, which would mean, hopefully, that the analysis was less depressing, if you like, than the one made in December. Yet the Sunday Times reported that we were less well prepared to leave on the 31st of October than we have been on the 29th of March.
I can understand why they said that, and I think it relates to the point that the chairman made about pressures on warehousing particularly, and also the nature of the flow of certain fresh foods. But overall, as a government, we are more prepared, and it is also the case that third parties are more prepared. And without wanting to take his name in vain, when the Governor of the Bank of England appeared in front of the Treasury Select Committee yesterday, he made the point, while still obviously concerned about the consequences of no deal Brexit, that it was undoubtedly the case that overall we were better prepared now than we were before.
Okay. Can I ask about the intervening period between the analysis we saw and Yellowhammer's publication by the Sunday Times? The previous Chancellor of the Exchequer said, or was quoted as saying, that he didn't want to spend no money on preparing for no deal until it was absolutely clear that that was a likelihood, and he didn't regard it as one. And it was also reported that civil servants in Easter were sent back to their departments who previously had been involved in no deal preparations. So in the period between then and your taking responsibility as chairman of what we understand is now called XO, was any progress made to prepare for no deal?
Yes, but I think it's important to put it in context, because I think your broad analysis is right. Again, entirely fairly, Philip, when he was Chancellor, both thought that no deal would be bad for the economy, and also felt that it would be wrong to spend money, giving everyone the impression that no deal was now a principal option, because that would lead, in his assessment, to business pausing certain decisions and an effect on the currency market. So he didn't want it to become a self-fulfilling prophecy, as it were. Money was made available, some £4 billion, to help departments prepare in the run-up to March the 29th. Then in the immediate aftermath of the April 11th and the extension being granted to October the 31st, surge capacity that had gone into government departments in order to prepare for departure on the 29th or 11th returned to their home departments. And then there was a period, obviously, of political change, and then during which preparations were maintained, and departments, including my own, I was in DEFRA at the time, were seeking to ensure that we were ready for whatever the decision a new Prime Minister might want to make. And then as soon as the new Prime Minister came in, then preparations were significantly accelerated, including with the allocation of another £2 billion.
So during your period as Secretary of State for Environment, were you able to access all the money which you wanted to use for a possible no deal preparation, which we were told the Treasury had put aside?
Yes, specifically for the things that we needed at DEFRA, pretty much, but there were other frustrations that I had about, I think, I don't want to be unfair, and of course we're all governed by collective responsibility in government, but there are always lively discussions, though it wasn't that I felt that we didn't have enough money in DEFRA. It was that there were other things which I felt could and should have been done in order to prepare us that weren't being done. I'll take just one example. which is the issuing of EORI numbers, the numbers that businesses need in order to export. My argument at the time had been that rather than taking a passive approach, whereby we invited businesses to register, we should proactively register every business, both because it would make life easier for them and also as a sort of wake-up call to them to get ready.
Okay. One of the principles on which the Yellowhammer analysis is based is that the UK will be treated essentially as a third country by member states post our departure. Have we managed to achieve any bilateral deals with individual member states?
Yes. I think that there are several things. The first is that the European Commission has made certain, put certain arrangements in place on a unilateral and time-limited basis, but they've done so in order to ensure the free flow of passengers and goods as much as possible. Secondly, there have been conversations with member states about, for example, the rights of UK residents in those states. Everything from their access to healthcare to their ability to vote in local elections and so on. So there have been, and as we get closer to the possibility of leaving on October the 31st, so the appetite amongst member states in order to ensure that appropriate arrangements are in place grows.
Okay. Can I ask you just about one specific aspect which has caused this committee quite a lot of concern, and that is over the arrangements for the transfer of data between the UK and the rest of the European Union. How close are we to getting an agreement that we will have recognition of data adequacy in the event of there being a no deal Brexit?
I'm pretty confident that we would be granted adequacy. There are jurisdictions currently outside the EU, but which are Crown dependencies, Jersey, Guernsey, and so on, which have data adequacy. I can't see any reason why we shouldn't. There is a definite risk, however, of a gap after we leave before we get an adequacy rating. But I should say that for any company that may need to get personal data from the EU into the UK, there is information on the Information Commissioner's website about how to make sure that you have standard contractual clauses, which in effect will mean that you can carry on with the free flow of data as before. So in a way, data adequacy is a great thing to have. It relieves businesses of a particular worry, but businesses can take proactive measures that ensure, even in the absence of data adequacy being granted, that data can flow freely. So mitigation measures can be put in place.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Stephen Crouch.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning, Minister. If somehow the deal that the previous Prime Minister negotiated with the EU came back to the House of Commons, would you vote for it?
Yes.
You would? Okay. There are plenty of our colleagues who say that they've moved on and that the deal is dead. The Prime Minister keeps saying to me that he is determined to get a deal. As somebody who stuck by the previous Prime Minister and wanted to get that deal through, and as somebody who understands how incredibly difficult all of this is and the complex variables that are in play, in your mind's eye, can you see what a landing zone is for a revised deal with the EU?
Yes, I can. I voted 3 times for the deal, as I know you did as well, Stephen, and it was a compromise. I think I've said often on the floor of the House and in newspaper articles it was a compromise. There were parts of that deal that I didn't like, and I had a particular concern about the backstop for a variety of reasons. The Prime Minister's view that we can surgically excise the backstop means that, to my mind, the deal that he would secure as a result of that would be better. So while I would happily support and did happily support the Prime Minister, Theresa May's withdrawal agreement, I believe that our new Prime Minister is in a position where the deal that he hopes to secure would be a material improvement. The second thing that he wants to do is to make sure that there are changes to the political declaration that make it clear that we want to be outside the single market and the customs union, and we want to have a best-in-class FTA. Again, that was always my preference from the beginning, so I was prepared to compromise in order to make sure that we left. I think good people can differ about what a good deal looks like, but I do believe that the Prime Minister is making a request of the EU, which, while significant, is eminently achievable, because some people have speculated that the Prime Minister wants no deal above all. I absolutely don't believe that. I know how hard he's working to secure a deal. Had he wanted to deliberately engineer a no-deal outcome, he would have asked for far more than he's asked.
Do you believe that there's a genuine negotiation currently happening with the EU about a revised deal?
I know that there is. And I know that the energy that's being deployed by the Prime Minister, by my friend and colleague Stephen Barclay, and by David Frost is significant. I know that work is being done at pace in order to engage with the Commission and with ministers. One thing I would stress is that while I sit on the committee, XS, that discusses aspects of the negotiation, I'm not involved in them. I'm not involved in the front line. All negotiations, all work with other EU member states in order to get a deal is done by the Brexit Secretary and the PM and David Frost. The only contact that I have with other member states is just purely about preparations for exit. So when I go to Calais, I'm not talking about what the future shape of a deal might be. I'm simply there to look at the amber lanes in the lorry park.
At any point over the summer, have you felt uncomfortable that the rhetoric from the new Prime Minister is shutting down space that could be available for a potential compromise with the EU? In other words, is he backing himself into a corner that the EU can't help and get out of?
No, I don't think so. And I think that the Prime Minister reminded the House of Commons yesterday that at the and reminded us, I think, MPs in a meeting, that at the end of the Biarritz summit, that the German Chancellor had requested of the President of the Council changes to what had been agreed in order to make sure that it could pass the House of Commons and the PM could be confident with it. And I think there's another thing as well. Those of us who voted throughout for the withdrawal agreement have to acknowledge and have to recognise that the only proposition that actually ever commanded a majority in the House of Commons was for the proposition put forward by Sir Graham Brady, which is that the withdrawal agreement should pass, but with alternative arrangements for the backstop. And in that sense, while that's the Prime Minister's own view and the government's view, and in my view a wholly desirable and achievable outcome, it also has the merit of being something that the House of Commons has already said it would accept.
Can I just finally ask about one specific area that's covered in Yellowhammer, and you'll be familiar with what Yellowhammer says about risks to UK fuel supplies.
Yes.
And specifically the risks to the UK domestic refining sector created by the proposed tariff regime under a no deal scenario. Given the importance of UK oil refineries, and particularly in certain constituencies around the country, are you minded to look again at the draft tariff regime that the previous government put together?
These are sensitive issues, but I think it's important to recognise that the government put forward a draft tariff schedule. We've been looking at every aspect of it with a bias towards keeping it as it is, but looking at every issue in the round. That's one thing. Separate to that, we also recognise the importance of those 6 refineries across the UK to fuel distribution and to industry overall, and we're giving serious thought to making sure that we can, whatever the circumstances and whatever the future, help to support them, come what may, in providing the critical role that they play in providing jobs in locations across the country and fuel for British industry.
So we shouldn't consider the previous government statements on potential tariffs under no deal as the final word on this?
They're not the final word. We will be confirming shortly what alterations, if any, take place, but there's a bias towards keeping things as they are overall.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I just ask how shortly, in terms of timescale?
Well, I would hope that they would be published certainly before Parliament returns on October the 14th. My preference is sooner rather than later.
Stephen Kelly.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you very much, Secretary of State. We know that the withdrawal agreement was rejected 3 times, and that gave rise then to the cross-party talks. The cross-party talks, very serious talks, went on for a period of around 6 weeks, and from them a number of commitments and, if you like, concessions were announced by the Prime Minister, reflecting what Labour had been asking for particularly, which was more clarity about issues around the future relationship, so around the customs union, on dynamic alignment on environmental and consumer rights, etc., etc. As you know, that was branded as the withdrawal agreement bill, but that package, that new package, was never published. Do you think that withdrawal agreement bill should now be published by the government, as it would be a helpful stepping stone, if you like, for finding the basis for a deal?
I think the more informed the debate is, the better. I think that having sat in on some of those talks, I know that there was a sincere attempt by many in them to find common ground. I think that some of the people who were involved in those talks are no longer in government, so I think out of politeness, before making plain everything that may or may not have been discussed, I would have to make sure that the conversations had with those who were involved in those talks who are no longer in government, because I wouldn't want them to feel that there was any discourtesy to them. I should stress, as you know, that this was an attempt to find compromise. And following on from the point that I made to Stephen, there were some aspects of what we were proposing in those talks that made me deeply uncomfortable, but I felt that it was important to try to see if we could find a way through. People will form their own judgment about the good faith of the individuals involved, and about the merits of the package that came up. And I wouldn't want to try to influence people on that, but I do think if we can help this committee and Parliament know as much information as possible so they can come to an appropriate judgment, then that's something I'd like to do.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful, and perhaps we may be able to follow up on that, Chair, but that's something we can discuss. I wanted to then just move on to how the negotiations would work with the European Union in the event of a no deal. The legal basis would, of course, shift from Article 50 to Article 218. On the 31st of August, Michel Barnier wrote that in the case of a no deal, all the UK's financial and other obligations from its past EU membership will continue to exist, as well as obviously the international obligations it has to protect the Good Friday Agreement in all its dimensions. So the message from the European Union is clear that even in the event of a no deal, the divorce items, if you like, under the Withdrawal Agreement and Article 50 are still in play, and no discussions, no mini deals, no FTA talk, no future relationship talk can possibly take place until those items are agreed. Do you agree with that analysis?
I absolutely agree that that is the position that Michel Barnier has taken, and he's faithfully reflecting the mandate that the Council has given him. And I'll just say a little bit extra for clarity, and please cut me off if I'm going into too much unnecessary detail. The EU's been clear that they regard three things as central before we can move on to a future economic partnership. Citizens. I believe that everything that we've done in domestic legislation will mean that the EU citizens in the UK have all their rights, and those are guaranteed, but you can probe that in a second if you want. Then the second thing is financial obligations. The financial obligations that were agreed as part of the withdrawal agreement are dependent on a withdrawal agreement existing. In the absence of a withdrawal agreement, I think people agree that there would be obligations that the UK has to the EU, but the precise nature of them, the size of them, I think is open to debate. And then the third area is maintaining the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. I think that the backstop that exists in the current withdrawal agreement was a sincere attempt to resolve some of those issues, but there are other ways in which those issues can be fairly resolved as well. But the broad analysis that you have, I think, is a fair one. But of course, the EU Commission's the negotiating mandate the Council gives the Commission can always change. And you're also right, of course, that the Article 218 process it requires a degree of acceptance by individual member state parliaments of anything that's agreed, which the Article 50 process doesn't.
Thank you. Just one final question. Focusing specifically on the Northern Ireland piece in all of that, the European Union's clear that everything has to be done to protect the Belfast and Good Friday Agreement. If we leave without a deal, that would be done under an Article 218 process, but by definition would take much longer, because that would surely fall under the category of a mixed agreement and would therefore require ratification by 28 member state parliaments. So in the meantime, what measures could be possibly put in place to discuss alternative arrangements? Because you wouldn't be doing that in a transition period under Article 50.
No, quite.
You would be doing that in a third country. We would be a third country at that point. So how would we manage that process?
You're absolutely right. It is the case that in the event of a no-deal exit, there are particular challenges which are more acute in Northern Ireland than elsewhere. And again, I don't want to apportion blame or in any way, but we have said that in order to ensure that the spirit and the letter of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement are abided by, that we will, for example, maintain a common travel area, that the only checks that we would impose would not be at the border, but would be those absolutely mandated by international law. At the moment, we don't know. This is not a criticism, just an observation. The precise requirements that the Commission would have of Ireland as a member state, we would like to have more conversations both with the Commission and with the Republic of Ireland about what one might do in the event of no deal before we then moved to whatever a new agreement might be. But it is, unless I'm misunderstanding your question, it is the case that there are additional challenges posed, absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Peter Bone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chancellor, you said in earlier evidence that you would vote for the previous deal if it came back before the House. Now, I assume there is no chance of the current Prime Minister bringing that deal back. He said it's dead, but of course we now have a situation where we have an alternative government on certain days. The Chairman's bill came through that method. So if there was, say, an SO24 that led to the agreement being brought back, though it's not government policy, you'd still vote for it?
No. I hope, without wanting to be too, what's the word, going too far down a hypothetical route, my preferred option is the deal that the Prime Minister has set out. If that were impossible, in a world where we couldn't pursue it, it was completely off the table, it couldn't happen, and the choice was between staying in the European Union, leaving with that deal, or no deal, I would leave with that deal. But we're not in that world now. The Prime Minister is putting forward, and I believe can secure a better deal than that was secured, that which was secured by the last government. So there's a hierarchy. We all have our hierarchy of our favoured outcomes. One of the problems has been that in the House of Commons, we haven't yet reached a point where we can all agree. I think that we can all agree on the Prime Minister's, or most of us can agree on the Prime Minister's proposition, because as I mentioned earlier, it's the one thing that has actually secured a majority in the shape of the Brady Amendment. I hope that's helpful. I'm not trying to suggest that we should bring it back, despite strong arguments that have been made persuasively for such an outcome by some colleagues. My view is that the Prime Minister's deal is preferable, but I want to be honest about why I voted as I did in the past.
So, Mr. Chairman, I think I understand what the Chancellor is saying. He's saying that if the alternative was staying in the European Union, he would vote for what we can call, shall we call, Mrs May's deal.
Exactly.
Shorthand. Even if that was against the policy of the Prime Minister, because we may be forced to stay in the European Union after the 31st of October because of the Chairman's bill. And it's quite possible, as we've seen, that it's possible to get this previous agreement brought back through other means in the House. Surely that cannot be your position, sir.
Well, I'm not sure, again, how it could be brought back.
Well, I think Mr. Kinnock might have some views on that. But anyway, I will leave that point because what I really wanted to ask about was if there is, as is possible, a general election called, say, on Tuesday of next week, and the House dissolves shortly afterwards, the Act of Parliament will be there that's saying that we will ask for an extension. That's clear. But of course, it's not in our gift to get that extension. We have to have the European Union agree to it. And as the Minister responsible for no deal planning, what will you be doing when Parliament is dissolved? Will you be continuing with preparations in case the European Union doesn't grant an extension, or will you just be off around the country campaigning?
The former.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Now, I think Richard Graham's line of question he wants to pursue follows directly on from Peter Bowen's.
That's very kind, Chairman. And Chancellor the Duchy of Lancaster, the points you made earlier were extremely helpful because they're consistent with what you've said over a long period of time, which is that you greatly prefer a deal over no deal. And of course, the new Prime Minister said that it's 1,000,000 to 1 against no deal. Chancellor Merkel called for alternative proposals on the backstop to be put within a month. What progress do you think has been made, and how likely is it that any further progress could be made during a general election not least considering that the European Commission might take the view they need to wait for the outcome of the general election before continuing negotiations?
Well, my hope would be that we will secure progress in the talks which are ongoing before the October Council and secure an agreement at the October Council. But one thing that, despite the thoughtful and tempting questions from Peter, Stephen and yourself, Richard, is that I can't anticipate every aspect of the future. What I can do is, and this is my principal job, prepare for our exit, support the Prime Minister in his efforts to get a deal, and acknowledge that in the straightforward choice between staying in the European Union, i.e. no Brexit, and no deal, that no deal would be preferable for me, and that is the government policy as well. So those are the broad parameters. And within that, of course, there are a number of potential hypothetical scenarios that people can put, but it's not, I think, it is difficult for me, when you're thinking about all of these hypotheticals, to follow impeccable reasoning, though as yours is, all the way through and then say, and then we would do X, because we're talking about a fast-moving political situation. But I'll try my very best to give you the principles by which the government will steer and which, of course, I agree with.
Thank you. And I understand that, Minister, but nonetheless, you would accept that there are some people who would say, looking at the timing of likely events, with the likely calling for a general election, the likely timing of that, that if a general election happens 2 days before the European Council meeting in mid-October, it would be extremely hard at that stage suddenly to produce a deal out of a hat that resolves the backstop conundrum. And therefore the question I'd love to ask you, bearing in mind that you abstained last night on my amendment, which was to call for a vote on Monday the 21st of October, between whatever deal was then available, whether the original deal negotiated by the Theresa May government or the withdrawal agreement bill that was negotiated between parties but never yet, but will be soon published, or some new deal that the new government produces, to have a vote on that in Parliament, which could be done through an amendment to the Queen's speech, which will presumably happen on Monday the 21st of October.
Yes,
in that scenario, would you agree that it would be important for Parliament to have the chance to vote on a deal, whatever that deal was, old one or new one, before then proceeding to a default position of a no-deal exit from the European Union? We're agreed that we must leave, we're agreed on the date, if that's conceivably possible, but do you agree that it is right that Parliament should be able to vote on a deal?
I'll say three things. A, that decision is ultimately a matter of collective responsibility, above my pay grade. Secondly, my colleague and our friend Andrew Bridgen was on the radio this morning saying that the last 2 days have seemed like 2 weeks in political terms. I think it's perfectly legitimate to say, if X, then Y, and would that lead you to do Z? Absolutely legitimate. But I think at this stage, I would not, and I don't think anyone else in my position would want to give a hostage to fortune by definitively saying, oh, I'll definitely do that. Again, for illumination. I just wanted to make sure, going back to the Chairman's earlier question, when I was asked by Andrew Marr, what might you do? I just wanted to see what the legislation was, just in order to make sure that it was compliant with existing statute and that it was compliant with existing law. It's perfectly possible for someone to say, this is a bill that we're presenting that may create all sorts of particular challenges and issues, and I wouldn't want to state definitively until I saw all the facts in front of me what I thought the wisest course would be. But anyone who knows me could infer from everything I've said in the past that I have a strong commitment to the rule of law. Anyone who knows me would infer from everything that I've done that I believe that the Prime Minister's deal is the best deal and we should do everything possible we can to get it.
And you stand firmly by your previous remarks that there is no good time of year to leave the EU without a deal?
I do, but there is also the case that however challenging aspects of no deal are, this government is working harder than ever to mitigate them, and ultimately in a choice between staying in the European Union or leaving without a deal, it is definitely better to leave, albeit without a deal, because that honours the democratic mandate of the British people. We said that we would honour the vote in the referendum. We have to do that. And of course, it is the case, and we can all have a judgment about the scale or height of the bumps of the road, the extent of dislocation of leaving without a deal. But we're a strong and resilient country. We could get through that, and there are all sorts of opportunities for life outside the European Union that we could take, which would ensure that we would prosper.
If I can have one very small, tiny question, if the Minister wouldn't mind. Personally, I would accept all of that, but is there a risk that Conservative candidates in the next general election will be asked to sign a bit of paper that says, I sign up exclusively to leaving the European Union without a deal?
I don't think so. It doesn't seem at all likely to me.
Thank you.
Right, Pat McFadden.
Thank you, Secretary of State. Can I take you back to your initial exchange with the Chairman about his bill? Both you and the Prime Minister have said, you today, the Prime Minister, over the last couple of days, that you'll obey the law. Can I tease this out a little bit? We now know what that bill says. It's expected to complete its stages in the House of Lords, possibly by tomorrow, who knows. But now that you've seen it, we know what it says. Does that mean complying with the terms of that bill, which in certain circumstances call on the government to ask for an extension to the Article 50 period?
Well, the bill hasn't yet completed its passage, and we will see, and indeed an amendment was passed last night, which raises other issues. Again, my view is properly constituted statute, passed in the right way, places an obligation on the government that believes in the rule of law to obey that statute. That's my view. Beyond that, I wouldn't want to go, because I think I could only either fuel speculation or lead people to say, oh, he's quibbling or whatever. I don't want to quibble. I want to state that clearly.
But how do we reconcile that with the Prime Minister also saying it has to be the 31st of October, do or die? Yesterday, he said that a number of times. Yesterday, at Prime Minister's questions, quote, unquote, I will never allow that, i.e. an extension beyond the 31st of October. So how do we reconcile a statement by you, which is governments obey the law, and if the law says whatever it says, governments must abide by it, and a statement by him that he will never apply for an extension beyond the 31st of October?
Well, it's a fair point, but I won't get into that speculation.
But how are we to make sense of these two statements? They don't make sense. They can't
Well,
be reconciled.
We could have a long conversation about the many ways in which they might be reconciled, but it's not for me to get into that conversation.
There are reports in some of the press today that the Prime Minister may even resign rather than do that. Is that a possibility?
I don't think the Prime Minister has any intention of resigning. He was elected in a leadership election in which I took part. He won that leadership election. He won the argument in that leadership election. He's assembled a strong team. He's made significant progress, both in dealing with our European partners and also in an exciting domestic agenda, which, if you'd like me to run through, I shall. So, no.
But if he doesn't get the general election that he wants, he will have to face up to the irreconcilable statements that I've put to you. He will have to face up in the next few weeks, if the bill is passed, to either complying with it or changing the statement that he's made that he would never apply for an extension.
These are fair points for reflection, but again, to return to my role is to prepare for our departure on the 31st, which is the current legal default. I will do everything I can in order to mitigate any challenges and to maximise any opportunities from that. The broad political position that I take, I've had an opportunity to outline, and I absolutely accept the clarity of your questioning in those points, but they're not questions which I feel I can answer in my role.
Let me ask you one on a different, slightly different point, which is your direct responsibility about no deal. If we leave the EU on the 31st of October without a deal in place, is that a lasting state? Is that something that could continue for some years? Is it an end point?
It's theoretically possible that it could continue for some years, but I don't believe it's an end point. So it is theoretically possible that the UK could continue to trade with the EU as a third country on WTO terms for some time. It's also possible that some of the other arrangements that are part and parcel of EU membership would fall away and not be replaced. But I think most people, certainly I think, that following on from the point that Stephen Kinnock made, that whether or not we moved quickly to negotiations under Article 218, or whether there were other conversations that occurred, that we would not be in that situation forever. There are perfectly legitimate arguments made by respectable and thoughtful economists that WTO terms, strictly in economic terms, might be an advantage. My own view is that seeking a free trade agreement, a best-in-class free trade agreement with the European Union is in both our interests. And ultimately, in the same way as we want to have free trade agreements with Australia, the United States, New Zealand and others, so we should seek to have a free trade agreement with Europe. And it's also the case that because of other interests that we have, security, education, science and so on, that we should seek to have agreements in those areas as well.
So no deal is not an end point?
No deal is, again, without wanting to go back to my earlier question, no deal is never an end point in the sense that the EU will change, the UK will change, but I think you're absolutely right to hone in on the fact that if we leave without a deal, that brings a degree of assurance and certainty in some areas against which we can plan, but it's also the case that conversations can then go on about how we can build a better relationship in the future.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Jonathan Ginogly.
Thank you, Chairman. Minister. There are tens of thousands of small UK businesses that are not VAT registered that will need to get an EORI number, an Economic Operators Registration and Identification number, before 31st of October. What is the government doing to ensure that they do so?
Those businesses that are below the VAT threshold?
Yes.
Yes. We're communicating through the business information campaign that we launched earlier this week in order to say to every business that exports to the EU that you need an EORI number. Now, as you'll appreciate, we don't know the precise number of businesses that are in that position, but given where the VAT threshold is, it's not a massive number of businesses, but we want to make sure that every business in this country has what it requires in order to be ready. The EORI number, if you do export to the EU, is a necessary but not sufficient tool to continue exporting.
Right, so I understand that some 240,000 businesses will require the EORI number. Do you know how many have applied for it so far?
Yes, well, I think it is the case that we know definitively that there are around 150,000 businesses which are VAT registered and which trade with the EU but not beyond it. The number of businesses below the VAT threshold, we can't know perfectly. It's an informed guesstimate. Of the 150,000, we had north of 60,000 who'd registered, and then we authorised that the additional businesses that had not yet registered should receive that number automatically. So they should now or have or be in the process of getting that number.
Thank you. And can you clarify whether businesses will need both a UK and an EORI number in the event of a No Deal Brexit?
It depends whether or not they export from the UK into the EU or both export from the UK into the EU and from the EU into the UK. If your company exports from the EU into the UK, so your goods are on the market here, you will need an EU EORI number.
So the government advice online is that EORI numbers will not be necessary for moving goods between Northern Ireland to Ireland under No Deal. Does the EU share that view?
the EU has been reticent about a number of aspects of what may happen in the event of no deal between Northern Ireland and the Republic. And that's for reasons which are understandable given its own internal politics. We would obviously like the EU and the Republic of Ireland to be in a position where they can say more.
But you can't say any more at the moment as to how you're going to move that forward.
Every business that exports to the EU, including businesses that export to the Republic of Ireland, would be well advised to get an EORI number. We're issuing EORI numbers to every company, as I mentioned, every organisation that's in that position that is VAT registered.
And Chairman, if I may, you spoke about the assessment of delays going from the UK to Calais, or actually in the UK. But I'd just like to ask slightly from the other side, the French side.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Yellowhammer set out various planning assumptions. One was France will impose EU mandatory controls on UK goods on day one of no deal, and there's built infrastructure. On day one of no deal, 50 to 85% of HGVs travelling via the short straits may not be ready for French customs. The lack of trader readiness combined with limited space in French ports to hold unready HGVs could reduce the flow rate to 40 to 60% of current levels within one day. So what is your planning assumption now of how French customs will react?
Okay, helpful question, and it gives me an opportunity to revisit an earlier point that the chairman made. In the Yellowhammer document, it says, what is our base scenario, as in what do we expect will be unalterable facts, and the base scenario, or facts that we know are givens. So the base scenario is, if we leave, then we're a third country, trading on WTO terms, and the base scenario is also that the EU will impose, for example, sanitary and phytosanitary checks. So that's the base. These are facts that until either the EU or the French state changes them are the basis on which you can then make a judgment about what a likely or reasonable worst case scenario is. So it's important to distinguish between the two. The base, the agreed facts, which are unambiguous, the reasonable worst case, looking at those facts, what we think, given the state of preparedness, is a scenario against which we should judge. Having visited Calais last Friday, it's clear to me that at the moment, the EU will require all vehicles that arrive at Calais to be compliant, both in SPS and in customs terms. However, without wanting to depart from that fact, it is also the case that French politicians, Xavier Bertrand, who's the president of the France region, and Mr. Darmanin, who's the equivalent of Rishi Sunak in the French government, they both said that they wanted to be as pragmatic as possible. So I don't want to get anyone's hopes up unnecessarily, but it is the case that there is a political willingness on the French side. If that political willingness results in a change to how those checks will be applied, then the base scenario will change because those specific facts will change. And to go back to your point about the 40 to 60%, that was based on an assessment both of trader readiness and of traffic flow. And if you get a higher level of trader readiness, then that worst case scenario can be changed. I'm sorry to go on at such length, but it's important for me to try to be as transparent, well, to be transparent with the committee, because people, for understandable reasons, sometimes say base, worst, and all the rest of it. I'm trying really to put it all in context so that people can recognise again, to go back to it in a nutshell, no deal, significant challenges, but we're seeking to mitigate.
I understand, Secretary of State, that in relation to France, you can't say this is what's going to happen. No, I fully understand that. I think what people will want to know is that you've got the processes in place with the French.
Yes.
And the relationships in place with the French.
Oh, yes.
So that when these things that you're saying could be, that we can adapt and move quickly.
Oh, yes.
And perhaps you could just explain a little bit about what is set up between the UK and France so that we can move quickly when we have to adapt.
Yes. Well, the fruits of the visit from last Friday were that Mr. Darmanin said that the French and the UK government would cooperate in advance of October the 31st to model and deal with the testing of systems in the event of a no-deal scenario. I had the opportunity to visit the new berths and booths that would be used in order to make sure you had the maximum flow of lorries. I had a chance to see the French system, which means that if everything is compliant well before you reach the port of Dover, you can have absolute confidence that your consignment can go through. I also saw the fact that there's a specific slip road, as it were, for fish and shellfish, which arrive in Calais to go straight to Boulogne, where the border inspection post is for the Boulogne market, so they can be freshly sold. So the French have done a lot, and we have committed to stay closely in touch to see what more we can do in order to mitigate any problems that arise.
Okay, thank you. So can I just check one thing? You used the phrase base scenario a
Yes.
minute ago. Now, I did ask you at the beginning of this session whether the words base case or base scenario appeared in the Operation Yellowhammer report, and I think you said no.
Yes.
Do you want to revisit that?
Yes, that was the reason why I mentioned it, that there is a difference between base scenario and base case. So I will try and explain again.
But all I need for the moment, because you explained it in answer to Jonathan, but the words base scenario do appear in the Yellowhammer report. So you're correcting what you said earlier. No, that's fine.
Absolutely.
Just for the clarification. Very helpful. Right, Joanna Cherry.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chancellor. Stephen Crabb asked you whether there are genuine negotiations going on between the United Kingdom and the European Union, and you said that you knew that there were, and mentioned that David Frost, the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union, and a third person from the Prime Minister's office was involved.
The Prime Minister himself.
The Prime Minister himself. Can you tell us who the EU counterparts are that are involved in these negotiations?
Yes. Well, obviously the counterpart for the Prime Minister will be the heads of state, because he's at the moment, heads of government of the EU member states. It is the case that my understanding is that I'm not involved in those negotiations, but that the role that had been played in the past in negotiations by certain members of the Commission has now been taken over by Stephanie Rizzo. And it is the case that Secretary of State Barclay's principal interlocutor would be Michel Barnier until that changes. But it is, of course, the case that, by definition, David Frost, as the Prime Minister's Sherpa, will talk to the Sherpas in other member states. So those could be people in the Prime Minister's office in the Republic of Ireland or in Spain. And, of course, Steve is has visited other EU member states on a very regular basis, and he'll talk to a range of politicians there. So, for example, Steve, when he visits the Irish Republic, will talk to the Taoiseach.
So Michel Barnier is involved in negotiations with the United Kingdom at present. Is that your position?
No. I think it is the case that a web of negotiations go on, but if one's talking about the I was about to say titular, the real equivalents, but then the opposite numbers. Let me give you, I suppose, a case in point. My direct opposite number in the House of Commons is John Trickett, but it might well be the case that in the course of the conversations that we have, that I'll be having a conversation with Keir Starmer or with Sue Hayman about particular aspects of my portfolio in which they have a legitimate interest.
But as I understand it, the previous negotiations were conducted either by the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union or the previous Prime Minister with Monsieur Barnier. There are no such negotiations going on at the moment, no negotiations between the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union and Michel Barnier, is that correct?
Most of the time, that negotiations that went on under when Theresa was Prime Minister were conducted by representatives of Task Force 50, while Michel Barnier was, of course, the Commission's principal negotiator, a lot of those negotiations were carried on by a very talented Commission official called Sabine Whale, with Oliver Robbins, who was the Prime Minister's Europe advisor in the Cabinet Office. Nothing is precisely identical, but essentially the role that Oliver Robbins was played is now being played by David Frost. And my understanding, though I'm not involved in these conversations, is that Sabine Whale is moving on, that she is likely to be a DG in Ursula von der Leyen's new Commission, and that the role that was played by Sabine Whale will be played by Stephanie Rizzo. I think that is right.
So are there
but if I've got any of that wrong, then I'll write to let you know.
But are there any negotiations going on directly with Stephanie Rizzo?
My understanding, again, I'm not involved, my understanding is that David Frost has been talking to people in the Commission, and Stephanie Rizzo is, I believe, his principal interlocutor.
But talking to people in the Commission is very different from conducting negotiations. I'm trying to establish who the counterparts are in the negotiations to which you referred.
There are teams on either side, and I don't know the full composition of either team.
Yesterday, at Prime Minister's Questions, the Right Honourable and Learned Member for Beaconsfield asked the Prime Minister why it has proved impossible in the course of the current legal proceedings in Scotland, in which I am a petitioner and a number of other parliamentarians and the government are the respondent, Mr Grieve asked why it has proved impossible to find any official or minister prepared to state that the reasons for the prorogation were to pave the way for a Queen's speech. Now, the Prime Minister didn't answer the question. Are you prepared to answer that question?
Well, again, all I can say is that I'm aware that there's a live proceedings at the Court of Session. B, that there will have been legal advice that the Prime Minister and others will have received that I have not seen. I wholeheartedly support the Prime Minister's decision, but I was not involved in the prior decision-making process, so it wouldn't be fair for me to say anything in that, because I've made mistakes in the past, but I would be blundering into legal territory where I wouldn't provide any clarity for anyone.
Is it true that both Nicky Da Costa, the Director of Legislative Services, and Mark Sedwell, the Cabinet Secretary, have refused to sign witness statements for the Scottish proceedings for fear of having to either perjure themselves or tell a truth that would be damaging to the government?
I have absolutely no idea. I haven't asked either of them about that, so I wouldn't have cared.
I'm just wondering whether we're straying into an area that's before the court, and we shouldn't be doing that instead of...
Well, I haven't heard anything that is disorderly since, as Joanna has pointed out, these issues were raised in the House yesterday, and the Speaker didn't rule them disorderly. I don't see why they could be disorderly today.
Thank you.
But please carry on.
I've been advised, Chancellor, by a number of reliable sources that the key figures in number 10 and the government are communicating about the real reasons for prorogation through unofficial channels, that is to say personal emails, WhatsApp and burner phones. To your knowledge, is that true?
No, a burner phone.
Yeah, that's a phone that's quite often used by a drug dealer, which can't be tracked. Phones which can't be tracked by the authorities or by the courts because they're used once and then thrown away.
All news to me.
Okay. If you were asked to provide an affidavit for the courts as to the reasons for the prorogation, that's obviously evidence or testimony sworn on oath, would you be prepared to do so?
I wasn't involved in the decision. I supported it when we were told about it, or rather, when the strategy was outlined to the Cabinet and the reason behind it was outlined. So I don't imagine that I could provide more information that was material other than that which the Cabinet had. But again, one of the things that I would say is that when dealing with these issues, as a minister, I would always want to have the advice of the Attorney-General about what I should or shouldn't do, because I'd want to follow the ministerial code, adhere to the rule of law, and take his advice.
When were the Cabinet advised of the plan to prorogue Parliament?
I think the date's in the public domain. I can't recall it off the top of my head.
Can you confirm that date for us after this evidence session in writing, please?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Craig McKinley.
Thank you very much, Chancellor, as you'll be aware, there are a number of little side deals, mini deals, making things flow from both sides.
Absolutely.
That the European Parliament has agreed. I would suggest that after today you've got one other job. It's the mutual recognition of pallets. I'd hate to see Brexit abandoned because of pallets.
I think we're probably okay on the pallet front, notwithstanding the point that the chairman made.
Yes, yes. I'd love to see the arrangements on the Polish-Belarus border, whether they're that bothered about pallets, but there, we'll put that aside. Let's just go back to the food issue.
Yep.
Because, this is part of the fear that we've been hearing, higher food prices and delays and shelves looking like something out of a Cuban supermarket, of which I've visited. I don't actually believe any of it. Let's look at a particular product and a particular country that is really reliant on UK exports, and that would be the Spanish producers. Often they produce out-of-season cucumbers, lettuces, short-dated, very much short-dated. Obviously they produce citrus that we don't produce for ourselves. So quite interesting to note that the EU external tariff on cucumbers, 12.8%. I don't actually know of any other country that we import from that's not an EU country. So I don't suppose that many of those tariffs are ever raised. But let's just think of that Spanish lettuce or cucumber grower. He has a regular market with one of the major UK supermarkets.
Yep.
By default, he obviously hasn't got a market elsewhere, otherwise he wouldn't be selling to us now. You know, can't suddenly increase the consumption of cucumbers in Germany to make up for any that he's not selling in the UK. Now, I would have thought it will be within our will, should we so wish, to not apply the EU external tariff on cucumbers, and I believe we can do that instantly and temporarily, subject to WTO approval. But given our demand would be for a 0% tariff on Spanish cucumbers, even if we were a third country, I can't imagine the WTO would complain about that, because that is, at the end of the day, their raison d'etre. So let's just analyse this Spanish grower. He'll have a local haulier that does a regular run up to Britain. So we've taken away the tariff. The man wants to sell to us because it's a regular market that he's reliant upon. The haulier does a regular run that he's reliant on. Where in any of that scenario, given that at Dover we're not going to start stopping that within our gift and not stop that lorry and take it apart any more now than we would in the future, where is the higher food in that process? Because I'm struggling to see it.
It's a brilliant and very helpful analysis. The one challenge is the one the chairman identified earlier, which is that if it is the case that lots of lorries from the UK carrying our exports were to get to Dover and they weren't to have the documentation and they were then to go over and they were to be held up, then that would mean that the flow back onto the lorries, back onto the ferries coming to the UK would be, the pipe would be narrower as a result. And if you had that big time, you could potentially have delays as the Spanish lorries, while they're desperate to get on, have to wait until the British lorries are sent back. That's why we're doing everything we can to make sure that UK hauliers, EU hauliers and UK companies know what they need. If they have what they need, there is no reason why there should be disruption. And that's why the best case scenario is no delay at all.
I mean, I would imagine that haulier, that Spanish haulier, I know the haulage business, it operates on very, very skinny margins across the whole of the EU. There will be desperation because that lorry's got to get back to Spain and then perhaps haul over to Germany. So there would be outrage, and the whole of the logistics industry of the whole of the EU would be affected if the French, for whatever reason, created that bottleneck at Calais, Dover.
Well, again, 3/4, it's actually slightly more than that, of hauliers who operate in the UK come from the EU, principally but not exclusively from countries like Poland and Romania. So there's a shared interest that the EU have and its member states have in keeping things going. So even if, for some reason, there was inefficiency, which I don't imagine there would be at Calais, I think one would find that Spanish vegetable growers, Polish hauliers, Romanian exporters would all be saying, look, please, 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 can we make sure that this operates more effectively? Absolutely.
To go back to something you covered in very great detail, it was very helpful. And this is the clearance, what are the numbers? EORI numbers. People who haven't quite complied with everything, they might have to go up the amber lane in Calais. I've been involved with the Operation Brock meetings that we have on a regular basis with South East MPs and the appropriate ministers. Now, it felt, I had one yesterday, it felt that there was more of a sense of readiness before the 29th of March than I was sensing yesterday. And that blockage seemed to be HMRC. In arranging pre-clearance sites. They didn't seem to have got those really bound down just yet. The number of staff that they'll need to run those. It felt that everything had been rather candid in aspect for 6 months. And they're suddenly getting used to it again. Using the facilities of your department, can you please put a rocket under HMRC to make sure they do what they need to do at this time? And what's your experience of how they're they're managing at the moment?
Well, you're absolutely right. This is a matter of profound interest to Kent MPs and Kent residents, so I can completely understand why you want to raise it, and you are right that we do need to make sure that we're operating as quickly as we can. There should be 6 transit sites, 5 in Kent, 1 in North Weald in Essex. Things are absolutely on track for 4 of them. There are 2 that have fallen slightly behind. That doesn't mean that they're totally off track. We should have assurance in the next few days that everything is on course with them, and all the appropriate steps are being taken now by HMRC in order to make sure that those transit sites are up and running and ready for October the 31st. And to be fair, no one has been more energetic in seeking to make this happen than Jim Hara, the current number 2 at HMRC, who he and his team have been working incredibly hard to deliver whatever, what's the word, reasons for a certain delay there might have been with HMRC in the past, and it's nothing to do with HMRC staff, it's decisions that are made elsewhere. The political decisions have now been made, and the HMRC staff are working incredibly hard to deliver.
And just to pick up on something that Peter Bone raised earlier on, I know we've been on different sides of this. You were willing, with reluctance or otherwise, to accept the Theresa May deal. I wasn't under any circumstance. Have you ever understood the basis of the £39 billion as part of that deal? I've done my own calculations, and I could sort of see we were part of the multi-annual financial framework till 2020. I could sort of see a moral basis for that, because we were around the table when it was negotiated and all the rest of it. But I've really struggled to get to that £39 billion. Have you analysed it for yourself, and are you comfortable with it, given, of course, what the House of Lords' own report said a couple of years ago, saying, well, in international law, that perhaps there is nothing to pay?
I have had a look. I can't claim to have had the closest look in comparison to some in the Treasury. I think it is certainly the case that if we leave without a withdrawal agreement, there is a legitimate case for saying that the amount that we would give would be less than had been previously thought, and the way in which we would pay might be different from that which had been conceived. But these are negotiating matters for the PM, the Chancellor, and Steve Barclay to decide. But it is perfectly intellectually legitimate and respectable to say that in the absence of the withdrawal agreement having been signed, that you can kick the tires on those figures.
Just very finally, you're far more of an expert on constitutional procedural matters than I. We have, possibly by tomorrow afternoon, this number 6 bill that we had great fun with yesterday afternoon. That could become the law of the land by tomorrow afternoon. Now, say there is a general election at the date that we would prefer, on the 15th of October, and the Queen's speech wouldn't come around until about the 21st. That would be very troublesome to have that number 6 bill in the Prime Minister's pocket, and he has to comply with that, when he goes to the Council of Ministers meeting on, where are we then? Was it the 17th?
Yeah, exactly.
17th? Would it be possible for a new Parliament to repeal that before he goes to that meeting? Because otherwise, that meeting becomes something of a waste of time.
It would be possible for a new Parliament to repeal it. I don't know about the timescale.
Okay, that's very helpful. Vera Hobhouse, thank you.
Good afternoon, Chancellor. I'm an EU migrant, as is well known, and for obvious reasons I stay very close to organisations who represent the 3.4 million EU citizens. And can I assure you that the hurt that has been caused in that community over the last 3 years is immeasurable? And can I first of all ask you, will you accept that there is a high human cost for all EU citizens who have been living in limbo for the last 3 years and who continue to do this by all their flip-flopping of this government?
Well, I completely accept that there has been uncertainty for some and disappointment for others at different points over the course of the last few years. But let me take this opportunity to reinforce, as I did, as I had the chance to in the House of Commons, that EU citizens who live in the UK are our friends, our neighbours, our family members, and we must do everything possible to safeguard your and other EU citizens or EU nationals' rights in this country, that the settlement scheme that has been put in place is designed to do exactly that, that broadly 1 million people have been granted status so far, some full settled status, some pre-settled status, And without wanting to make any criticism of any other EU member state, the guarantees that the UK has given EU citizens are more certain and more generous than that offered by a significant number of EU member states to UK nationals. And that's why I asked in the House of Commons 2 days ago if member states would be able to reciprocate. The position across member states varies. There are political constraints in different member states. But one of the things that I would also say is that right at the very beginning of the negotiation process, indeed in the immediate aftermath of the referendum, I was one of a number of politicians, including our current Prime Minister, who said that there should be no circumstances under which the position of EU citizens in the UK should be rendered uncertain or made a bargaining chip.
I mean, I would say it's worth reiterating that the uncertainty is caused by this country wanting to leave the European Union and not the other way around. I mean, I'm a British citizen and have been for many years, so I'm sort of okay, but the feeling of being in limbo continues, and no matter what this government is saying, it continues. So can I just ask, the Home Office published a new paper on EU citizens yesterday. So what will EU citizens arriving after the 31st of October 2019 have to do to be able to stay and work in the UK?
Well, they can apply for European temporary leave to remain, and that will mean that that application having been granted, they will have all the freedoms and access to services and the ability to work and study that one would expect.
But how will border control officers or employers or landlords be able to distinguish between those who turn up with their European passports, whether they have been actually arriving after the 31st or whether they've been living in this country for many years?
Well, everyone who has been living in this country for many years and who would like to apply for settled status, and I would encourage everyone to do so because their presence here is valuable. It's a relatively straightforward process, though there have been one or two administrative hiccups.
But how will a border officer distinguish between those who have settled status and those who have come here after the 31st of October? How will they do that?
There wouldn't be any need for the border individual to do so. There's a distinction between someone who can say, I've been here for a number of years and this is the evidence, we can look at the evidence, wonderful, settled status can be granted and we're reassured, and the way in which someone, until we have a new immigration bill in place, someone coming from the EU would come to this country. We're not imposing visa or other requirements, but we are saying that if someone who comes from the EU wants to ensure that they have the capacity to remain and potentially to go on to a route towards citizenship later, that they should apply for European temporary leave to remain.
You will have heard the story of my constituent who has actually been living here for over 30 years and applied for settled status and wasn't granted it, only pre-settled status. So the whole operation doesn't seem to work very well. And will you confirm again that the in limbo situation for the EU citizens, whether they're here or coming after the 31st of October, is very high?
No, I absolutely take the point. And as with any system, any computer system run by government or by the private sector, there will be occasions, inevitably be occasions, where an individual who has put in a properly constituted application, for whatever reason, the system may not respond to that appropriately. When that happens, that's wrong. We should move quickly to put it right. But it is the case that if people have the appropriate evidence of their residency here over that appropriate period, and they are EU citizens, then the granting of settled status or pre-settled status should be relatively straightforward. It is the case, as I say, that 1 million people out of the 3.4 have applied for status. The overwhelming majority who've applied have been granted status. There are one or two reasons why they might not be granted, potentially to do with past criminality, and there might be a reason why someone is not yet granted the status to which they're entitled, which may well be that the evidence that they present, for whatever reason, hasn't been presented in the right way or hasn't been processed in the right way. But overall, I think that the offer is generous, the intent is sincere, and the operation of the system has been driven by civil servants and ministers who are absolutely determined to make it as efficient as possible.
Can I tell you this? The system doesn't work. My constituent had his his settled status not accepted. The Home Office was meant to ring him last Monday and it didn't. But I leave it here.
I apologise to your constituent for the distress that they may have faced. and I will, of course, raise with the Home Secretary the specific case in order to make sure that we
there will
work
be
with
thousands like him, and only because he's a high-profile case, and now the Home Office is doing something about it, there will be thousands and thousands living in limbo.
The numbers are in question, but I do take your point.
Thank you.
Well, I've just had whispered in my ear a suggestion. Is there or could there be an MP's hotline to raise these particular cases? We have been waiting to take evidence from a Home Office minister, but one has not been identified as available before the prorogation. Is that something you could take back?
I certainly will.
Right, that's very helpful. Stephen Timms.
Thank you. Chair, can I go back to a couple of points that we've already covered? We took evidence yesterday from the Freight Transport Association, which told us that long delays at Dover for trucks wanting to go to Calais were inevitable if we left the EU without a deal on the 31st of October. Are you confident that they are mistaken about that?
I don't think they're inevitable, but they are a material risk.
The reason they explained to us that it's inevitable is really two things. One is that, as the Chair said earlier, there are 300 spaces in the lorry park at Calais which lorries will have to go through if they go into the amber lane. And secondly, that a significant proportion of the trucks coming to Dover will not, initially at least, have full customs documentation. I think we've talked about 40 to 60% being the customs expectation. Absolute minimum, we were told, this was the HMRC view as of June, is at least 20% will be turning up without adequate. So I think it's 10,000 trucks a day, isn't it? So you've got 2,000 trucks a day going through that amber lane into the 300 spaces. So what will happen, we were told, is that once the 300 spaces are full, the Calais authorities will stop further ferries coming from Dover, and then the lorries will back up along the motorway. So that's the account they gave to us, why they think long delays are inevitable. What's the flaw in their argument from your point of view?
Well, there's no flaw in the argument. It is a worst case scenario. But the two things that I would...
Sorry, why is it worst case? That's what I'm trying to understand.
Because there are at least two things that can be done to alter the assumption that 20% of lorries will arrive at Dover without documentation necessary. And they are making sure that hauliers and firms know what is required and take action to make sure that they have that documentation. And the number of people getting ready is increasing, as the Bank of England, in a very different context, acknowledged yesterday. And then the second thing is, even for those who are not compliant, doing everything possible to ensure that they don't actually reach Dover. And that's one of the reasons why, for example, the Department for Transport has introduced statutory instruments this week in order to ensure that people who are heading towards Dover, who are not compliant, can be turned away until they are.
What is the current HMRC assessment of the minimum proportion of trucks turning up at Dover who will not have adequate documentation?
Well, that's exactly what we're seeking to do at the moment. One of the things that I mentioned earlier, right at the very beginning when we're talking about the assumptions underpinning Yellowhammer, is that there are two things: trader readiness, traffic management. What we're trying to do is to deal with both of those, get a higher level of trader readiness, have a more sophisticated form of traffic management, and that we hope will reduce the incidence. But the one thing that I would say is that we've always got to plan for a reasonable worst case scenario. So it is perfectly possible to say, on the basis of everything we know, the chances of a worst case scenario appear to be diminishing, but we've still got to prepare for that worst case scenario. And then the other thing is, we can also say, even if that worst case scenario materialises, we don't think it will be quite as bad because of these other factors. So one of the things that I want to do is to share with this committee and with Parliament as much as possible about the way in which we make these judgments, as much as possible about the judgments that exist, and as much as possible about the mitigations that we're putting in place, so that you can hold me to account for saying X or Y intervention will clearly make it better. You've said that you should be doing it. Why aren't you doing more of it?
Can I just press you on this point about the HMRC assessment? Because what we were told yesterday was that in June, the HMRC assessment was that I think 40 to 60% of the trucks turning up at Dover won't have the full documentation. Absolute minimum, 20%. What is the current HMRC assessment for those figures?
It is being revised at the moment, but you're absolutely correct. That was the judgment at June.
So that is the most recent HMRC assessment, is it?
I'm not sure it's the most recent. I think that there have been 3 iterations, and I'm not sure if that was the second or the third, but I'll come back to you because it is being revised at the moment.
You see why it seems inevitable. If you've got 2,000 lorries going into 300 spaces in Calais, we've got a problem, and the problem will be very clear on day one.
Completely. But the part of one of the many merits of Yellowhammer, one of the many merits of this work, is that when you see a problem coming, you can try to take steps to deal with it. Now, those steps may be ineffective or they may be highly effective. I very much hope it's the latter. But you're absolutely right that the haulage industry, HMRC and others have correctly identified what the challenge will be if mitigation is not put in place. Mitigation can be put in place, and it's my responsibility to try to do everything possible to do that.
So you can certainly see why the Freight Transport Association is saying that long delays are inevitable.
I can see why they're worried, and the one thing that I would say is unless mitigation takes place.
There's no sign that we've seen of that mitigation taking place at present. If there is an update that we can be given, that would be very helpful. Well, can I just, the other question I wanted to ask you about was something you said earlier about data adequacy. And you recognise there will be, if we leave the EU without a deal, there will be a period after the 31st of October when we do not have a data adequacy determination.
Yes.
How long would you expect that gap to be before we get one?
Well, it's difficult to know. On the one hand, one would hope that it would be relatively rapid because, as I say, Crown dependencies have data adequacy even though they're outside the EU. On the other hand, the EU machinery has often been slow in granting data adequacy in the past. The third thing, as I think Joe Cherry will know, is that there are, because of the Schrems judgment and other factors, this is a politically charged area within the EU. All that having been said, companies can take steps through in order to reduce the concern. When you say
relatively rapid, what would count as relatively rapid in your view for getting this sorted?
Weeks.
You would hope we'd get a data adequacy determination within weeks?
I can't know, that's the thing, because it's a sovereign decision of the EU. I can make the argument, I can explain why I think it's in everyone's interests. Other people who are involved in the negotiations can make that case. Things may move. But again, my responsibility, I hope, towards this committee is to offer a view of what I hope could happen, but also to be clear about what may.
Yeah. You've made the point earlier that the alternative is for companies to introduce standard contractual clauses in their clauses. You'll know, I'm sure, the evidence from Tech UK that larger businesses, on the whole, have done that, and smaller businesses haven't, because it is quite a costly thing to do, to renegotiate all your contracts with your business partners and so on. So Tech UK has been surveying its members in the last few weeks, and they found that among smaller businesses, 53% had taken no active steps to prepare for no deal, mostly because they're unable to predict the implications of no deal. So you'd recognise, wouldn't you, that for small businesses, they, on the whole, they will not have these standard contractual clauses, and they will face very serious difficulties.
I think two points. It's a very, very fair analysis. Two things that I'd say are, one, it is the case, you are right, that as a general rule, larger businesses are more ready than smaller businesses. But the process of agreeing standard contractual clauses can be done relatively quickly. There is guidance on the Information Commissioner's website. There's guidance on the new gov.uk/Brexit set of pages about how to do so. So again, if action is taken promptly by businesses in the next 2 weeks, then these clauses can be put in place.
But it is a lengthy and complicated process to renegotiate all of your contracts with lots of different business partners. It's not a simple exercise.
It needed not to be, and again, it's unlikely to be the case. So I'd be grateful for the evidence that it would be it's not the most pleasant way to spend some of your time if you're a business person. I would freely grant that, but it is not an insuperable obstacle.
Just one final question, if I may, Chair. The government has been giving business readiness grants to some organisations like Tech UK and other business support organisations so they can support their members in their preparations. Those grants at the moment are due to run out on the 31st of October. there'd be quite a strong case, wouldn't there, for continuing those grants, if particularly if we leave with no deal on 31st October, into November and beyond, in order that those organisations can continue to support their members through what is likely to be a difficult period.
Yes, and indeed expanding them.
And?
Expanding them.
Is the government going to be expanding them?
At the moment, we're reviewing a range of measures that we can take in order to further enhance business readiness, yes.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Peter Grant.
Thanks, Chair. Could I go back to your comment from earlier on, Minister? The Prime Minister's view that we can surgically excise the backstop. Now, the Prime Minister wrote to Donald Tusk on the 19th of August, saying in terms that the UK can no longer continue to endorse the specific commitment in paragraph 49 of the December 2017 joint report. In effect, that tears up the agreed joint report of December 2017, certainly parts of what relate to relations between the UK, Northern Ireland and the rest of Ireland. Other than ongoing discussions with the Democratic Unionist Party, what discussions were there with anyone else in Ireland before the UK announced their intention to resolve from that agreement?
Well, I have been involved in the Cabinet committee that deals in the broad terms with negotiations, but I haven't been involved in those negotiations. So that's more properly a question for the Exit Secretary, the Prime Minister or the Foreign Secretary.
What reaction have you had from the Government of Ireland to that letter?
I personally haven't. But I'm looking forward to seeing the Taoiseach and other representatives of the Irish political parties and others at the British Irish Association in Cambridge this weekend.
Right. Would it be your expectation that they would welcome that backtracking with open arms? Would you expect them to have concerns about it?
I wouldn't want to speculate about the views of politicians in another jurisdiction for whom I have enormous respect. They will speak for themselves.
Well, Minister, your Cabinet colleagues are always only too happy in the Chamber to speculate about the way in which politicians in other countries will simply keel over and give the United Kingdom everything it wants. That seems to be what the Leave campaign have been saying for the last 5 years. But still, would you understand if the Irish government and indeed political parties and others in Ireland felt let down or even insulted that the United Kingdom should unilaterally announce its intention to withdraw from an agreement which incidentally was made only with the explicit approval of the DUP to begin with. The DUP vetoed the original version of that and had to be changed. Would you understand if various interested parties in both the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland felt they had been let down or even felt it was extremely discourteous for the United Kingdom to take a decision to unilaterally withdraw from that agreement without bothering to tell anyone on the island where it is most applicable?
I'm sure that politicians both in the Republic of Ireland and from different traditions and parties in Northern Ireland will have views and will communicate those views. As I say, I want to work pragmatically with politicians on both sides of the border in order to deal with the consequences if we do leave without a deal, and in order to ensure that when we get a deal that we can work in the interests of all the citizens of these islands. So I won't criticise any politician who may want to make a particular argument, not least because I'm not involved in those negotiations.
Right. The letter eventually makes specific proposals. As far as I can see, it's the only specific proposals the UK has made to the EU. One of them is from the Prime Minister. I propose that the backstop should be replaced with a commitment to put in place such arrangements as far as possible before the end of the transition period as part of the future relationship. The commitment that the UK want to resolve from in paragraph 49 of his joint report remains committed to protecting North-South cooperation and to its guarantee of avoiding a hard border. Any future arrangements must be compatible with these overarching requirements. There's no difference between the commitment that the UK is wanting to withdraw from and the commitment that it's now seeking to make, is it? Apart from the fact that the original agreement of 2017 gave explicit consequences should these alternative arrangements either not work or not exist. So isn't it the fact that all that the UK is asking to do is to make the same commitment that they made in 2017 and failed to keep, but to drop any consequences of failing to keep to the promises?
I don't think so, no.
So what are the consequences if the commitment that the Prime Minister is proposing to make in his latest letter, what are the consequences if that commitment is not kept? Perhaps it can help you if an almost identical commitment was made in 2017. The contingency, if the UK failed to honour that commitment, was what came to be known as a backstop.
Yes.
So can I put it to you that what the United Kingdom is seeking to do is to make the same commitment that it has failed to keep over the last 2 years, but is asking the Europeans, and the Irish in particular, to drop any safety net, any protection, any guarantee of continued compliance with the Good Friday Agreement in the event that the UK continues to do what it's always done, which is to fail to comply with its own commitments.
I now get to the nub of your question. It is certainly the case that those who designed and argued for the backstop believed that the provisions of the backstop were a way of protecting the gains since the Belfast Agreement was concluded. But the backstop as designed is not the only way in which you can ensure that the Belfast Agreement is met, and indeed there are sincere advocates of the Belfast Agreement who've expressed their concerns about the provisions contained within the backstop as it stands, and no one would suggest that either Lord Murphy of Torfaen or Lord Alderdice or Lord Trimble were anything other than sincere advocates of peace. Lord Trimble, of course, received a Nobel Peace Prize for his role in helping to conclude the Belfast Agreement, but Lord Trimble has written and outlined his concerns about the way in which the backstop is not the perfect way to maintain the principles and the letter of the Belfast Agreement. Now, people can legitimately differ from Lord Trimble, but nobody could say that Lord Trimble was an unrespectable or marginal figure in the debate about how we can best make sure that the Belfast Agreement is secured.
One final question, if I may. There have been repeated doubts raised. In fact, I think this committee on at least 2 occasions, one of them I think when you may still have been a member, has reported that we couldn't see how the government's previous red lines, which are still there, could be compatible with the requirements of the Good Friday Agreement. Now, given that the Prime Minister is now asking to replace the backstop with a commitment to put in place such arrangements as far as possible, not now, not by the 31st of October, but before the end of the transition period, clearly if the Prime Minister thought those arrangements existed today, he would say we'll put them in place today. So the Prime Minister is accepting that suitable arrangements don't exist today, will not exist on the 31st of October. If we leave without a deal on the 31st of October, there are no arrangements in place to make the management of the border in Ireland compatible with the Good Friday Agreement, are there?
Well, it is a huge question.
Simple answer would be yes or
no. It is the case that contained within the question are certain assumptions about what the Belfast Agreement does or does not require, which are contested.
So is it your contention that it's possible for the United Kingdom to leave the EU without a deal on the 31st of October, and that everybody who matters in Ireland will accept that the Irish border is continuing to operate entirely in keeping with both the letter and the spirit of the peace deal? Is that your contention? Can I say that it might be worrying to people in Northern Ireland?
No, I think that
if you can't give a definite yes to that, then
no. Well, I think the key point there is it's not for me to determine who everyone is.
You're the Minister for No Deal Planning.
No, it's not for me to determine everyone who, in your terms, matters in Ireland. And then the second thing is that, again, the history of politics in Northern Ireland and in the Republic of Ireland is one of open debate over the course of the last decade or two about how the Belfast Agreement can be built on and the shape of the institutions that can underpin peace. It's a an important, live and sensitive debate, and while I completely understand the argument behind your line of questioning, very respectable, these are delicate matters which would require a more detailed and thoughtful response than a simple yes or no.
Mr.
Chairman, Minister, I mean, one of the groups of people who matter, probably not the Scottish National Party in Northern Ireland, of course, is the unionist population.
Indeed.
It's the majority population in Northern Ireland, and of course in protecting the Belfast Agreement. One of the central points about the Belfast Agreement is the principle of consent.
Exactly.
And the withdrawal agreement as it currently stands does not coincide with the principle of consent, because it would change our constitutional status. So I'm glad that the government is actually looking for a way around. However, there's good news about the Irish border and the free flow across the Irish border and the honouring of that part of the Belfast Agreement. That there should be that cooperation can continue across the border, because the Irish government, in fact I think the Taoiseach yesterday indicated that they would not be, and they are now conclusive on this, they will not be putting any checkpoints along the border, but will have other means of monitoring trade across the border. What discussions have you had with the Irish government as to the practical ways in which they intend to do that, especially since they have made it quite clear they intend to collect tariffs on goods which come from Northern Ireland into the Irish Republic?
Well, you put your finger on a number of important points. The first one is that across the unionist community, including people who vote for parties that are described as non-aligned but who are supporters of the union, there has been concern that if the backstop were in operation, that there would be laws operating in Northern Ireland which Northern Ireland's elected representatives could not alter, and that creates a particular problem with the consent principle in the Belfast Agreement, never mind any other principles. And that is not everyone agrees with that, but it is a widespread view, certainly amongst the unionist community, and not restricted to one particular party. That is an important point to acknowledge. The second point is that there is a tension, as you quite rightly point out, between the EU protecting the integrity of its whole single market, which would, if you took it at its most rigid, mean checks at the border, and the Irish government's desire, absolutely, which I applaud, to avoid checks at the border. Now, I talked, in this current role, I have not talked to representatives of the Republic of Ireland government about what might happen in the event of a no-deal situation. I mean, no, other than a cordial and friendly meeting with the ambassador a couple of weeks ago. And to be fair to the Republic of Ireland, detailed negotiations have to go through the Commission. Member States have accepted that. It has been the case that in my previous role I talked to Michael Creed as Minister about certain specific questions that relate to food. I hope it will be the case that without going into negotiations that we can have more conversations with the Republic of Ireland, and not just with ministers but with others operationally, about making sure that we can achieve the situation that we would both want, which is the minimum amount of friction.
And this is the point which I find a bit strange, and I hope that you will, in your meetings with the Irish government, push this. The Irish government are insisting that they want to have as normal relationships between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic, and as normal relationships on trade between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic as possible. Now, if they have already, I presumably they have, if they're making announcements of no border posts, if they've already got in place or are putting in place or planning to put in place means of monitoring trade across the border which ensure that free flow without points, do you not accept that at least the very least they can do is to share with our government how that will operate, so that in turn that can be then shared with exporters from Northern Ireland, the Irish Republic, so that they know what to expect. And it seems rather strange to me that you're saying the UK government is still in the dark as to what these arrangements are going to be.
The more cooperation, the better. We know less than we'd like, and that's partly because of the Commission's way of operating rather than any individual decision by any politician in the Republic.
So that will be an issue which will come. Can I just ask another issue then about the cross-border trade? The Irish government has said that they intend fully to collect all taxes
on trade across the border. The tariff regime which the government has published to date would have no taxes being imposed on goods coming from the Irish Republic into Northern Ireland. And of course that does cause some concern to the agricultural industry and other industries in Northern Ireland, that on one hand the goods we sell to the Republic will be taxed on some of them quite a high rate, whilst the Republic will have free access into the Northern Ireland market without taxes. In the review of the tariff regime, will that be an issue which the government will be addressing, especially if the Irish government are saying it is perfectly possible and they've got means of collecting those taxes across the border without causing any infrastructure to be put in place?
I'm conscious of those arguments. We have no intention of collecting tariffs on goods going from the Republic of Ireland to Northern Ireland, but I should also say that if we did leave without a deal, then we would have tariffs on east-west trade, and that would have, and I would not want to see this, but that would definitely have a significant effect on the Republic of Ireland's agri-food sector. And so, in the event of no deal, I think the Republic would bear that in mind.
Well, if it is a case that goods can enter Northern Ireland, albeit if they leave Northern Ireland they'll be taxed, that does place producers in Northern Ireland at a disadvantage. Has the government any plans to compensate Northern Ireland producers for the fact that there will be that part of the United Kingdom where there can be the free flow of goods with no tariffs imposed on them, and therefore Northern Irish producers being placed at a disadvantage with producers from the Republic?
Absolutely, and we are giving active consideration both to the needs specifically of the agri-food sector in Northern Ireland and the wider Northern Ireland economy. We're very conscious of that.
Okay. Just a couple of final points from me, Mr. Gove. Did I hear you correctly? You said a moment ago that no tariffs would be collected on goods moving from the Republic of Ireland to Northern Ireland.
Yes.
Now, but you said they would apply if they were moving, say, from the Republic of Ireland to Holyhead?
Yes.
So how is that allowable under WTA rules?
It is the case that there is a specific exemption that is allowable, and the Attorney General has advised the government that the specific factors that pertain in Northern Ireland could mean that we could have an exemption for a period.
Does that have to be applied for, the exemption, or we can just apply it unilaterally?
I would have to return to explain to you in detail, having revisited the legal advice, exactly the provision.
I think if you could write to us, that would be jolly helpful. Is the government planning to introduce direct rule in Northern Ireland in the event of no deal?
We are trying as hard as we can to do everything we can in order to restore the executive in Northern Ireland.
I know that, but in the absence of an executive, because you did say to Sylvia Herman in March of this year, talking about in the current situation with no executive, it would be difficult to sustain in the uniquely challenging context of a no deal Brexit. That would include the real possibility of imposing a form of direct rule. Will that be necessary if the executive is not re-established?
It is a possibility,
right.
But I would not. But I think it's important to say that Northern Ireland Civil Service are doing a fantastic job. But there are certain, and there is guidance which enables them to act with a fair degree of discretion. But it is the case that the Northern Ireland Civil Service and others would want to have ministerial direction in certain circumstances, but I won't go into what those circumstances would be now because these are necessarily sensitive matters.
Is it the case that parliamentary authority for the civil service to take decisions in relation to Northern Ireland runs out in the middle of October and would have to be either renewed or replaced by direct rule in order to provide the ministerial input you've just referred to?
Again, it is my understanding that the terms of the EEFA bill are such that there would need to be some method of renewing that authority, or indeed some method of replacing it with ministerial direction. Yes.
Are you going to publish Operation Yellowhammer, the report?
What I hope to do is more than that. What I'd like to do is to make sure that we have the Yellowhammer once we've done the proper revision and the kicking of the tyres, alongside a publication which details the actions that the government has taken to inform and mitigate people, inform people of the consequences and allow people to see the mitigations that we've put in place, so people can make a proper judgment about the changes they need to make, what government has done, whether that's enough, and whether it meets the need outlined in a reasonable worst-case scenario.
Okay, and can I just ask on a specific question, will that include an assessment that has been made of capacity at Portsmouth in particular,
yes,
in the event of no deal,
yes,
and the extent to which that might affect medical supplies?
Yes, and it's a very... Sorry, I was going to say a very good point. All your points are good. What I mean is, it's a very important point because previous Yellowhammer scenarios had not looked at other ports other than the short straits in the degree of detail required. The Border Delivery Group have asked specifically for that, and without preempting what the content will be, absolutely.
So does that suggest that there are concerns about capacity at Portsmouth?
No, it suggests that, in fact, it doesn't suggest, it is the case that we wanted and officials wanted to be even more robust and to ask some questions. I won't editorialise, but the information about Portsmouth will be there. People have an opportunity to make a judgment about it. It is, in my view, at this case, not the case that what is revealed gives us any additional cause for concern.
But since we don't know what your cause of concern was previously...
Well, cause of concern is that Portsmouth was a priority port when it came to making sure that medical supplies arrived in the UK. Now, obviously, as I think I said in the House, our first aim is to ensure minimum friction at the straits. Secondly, maritime freight. Thirdly, air freight if necessary.
Mr. Gove, you've been extreme... Well, since it related to Northern Ireland, yes, Sammy, just very quickly.
Can I just ask, Minister, in light of what the Chairman has asked you about the consequences of no deal and there's no existence of the Assembly, if you do intend to continue with the situation where tariffs will not be collected across the Northern Ireland-Irish border, and you do intend to put some compensation arrangement in to support producers who will be affected by that, what's the mechanism for, first of all, devising that compensation scheme and administering it if you're saying that currently civil servants in Northern Ireland will have no powers to, don't have the powers to do that? Will it be done on a national basis, or does it require direct rule for that to be put in place?
It need not require direct rule for additional funding to be put in place, but there are constraints on what civil servants can do anyway. But there are also things that the UK government can do to supplement what Northern Ireland civil service do as well.
Okay, that's very helpful. Mr. Gove, thank you very much for coming today. You've been very generous with your time and appreciate it. And typically you've answered all of the questions that have been put to you. We may see you again, depends on what happens, or done. There we go.
Portcullis House, the Boothroyd Room.